I will pass it off to Jasmine, the Feed the Future team lead in the Office of Economic Growth and Environment, USAID Nigeria. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you so much thank you so much for passing it to me, and thank you so much for the opportunity to open this meeting. It's a very important meeting. The research that Tango, you guys are undertaking through REAL is extremely important for us, especially as we're going into our GFSS, our Global Food Security Strategy refresh, as we're looking at what we've done in the past 5 years and what we will be doing as we continue with the Feed the Future initiative. It is important for us to really look at how we are doing resilience, how we are being effective in making sure that we're transforming people's lives who have experienced extreme shocks and stresses, and giving them the opportunity to recreate a life or move on to a life that is filled with new skills from capacity building that we're doing, in addition to financial literacy and enabling them to access finance and have more access to opportunities to grow as individuals and build livelihoods, in addition to building social cohesion as people are moving throughout different areas within the Northeast, as we're speaking about resilience, particularly for this study. I do want to also highlight, as most know on this call, the levels of insecurity within Nigeria have heightened. Although in the Northeast, we have been focusing specifically on resilience there, the need for resilience support, shocks and stress support, is starting to show a need throughout the country, especially now focusing a lot in the Northwest. We're having transitions of people migrating to other areas looking for better life opportunities and getting away from insurgencies or insecurities or things that threaten their livelihoods. And as we see things developing throughout the country, having a moment to step back and look at what we are doing effectively in the Northeast and what we do need to change in order to make it more effective can pilot how we respond to the needs throughout the rest of the country. So it is essential for us to get this study in alignment with also the activities that we have functioning in the Northeast to really help us as we move forward with Feed the Future, as we design new activities, as we design new programming that really creates a transformative opportunity for the people of Nigeria. And so I thank you so much for this opportunity to give opening remarks, and I pass it over to Mark. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Jasmine. Next slide, please. Yes. So I will quickly go through the agenda for this presentation today. But before I do that, I want to just quickly introduce the members of the Tango team that have been involved in this study. We have on the call Tim Frankenberger, who's the president of Tango, myself, and then Gita Temsa, Charles Maish, Jessica Norfor, Robin Al-Haddad, Stephanie Martin, and many of you know Karen Fox is also a key member of our team. Unfortunately, she's not going to be able to be with us today. She's had a family emergency. So that's sort of the team. As you look through all of the participants, you'll see these names on here. So the team is all here to help answer any questions that come up. So basically what we plan to do today is, after we've gone through these quick introductions, just give a bit of a background and overview of the study design of this study. And really what we're going to be focusing on mostly today is discussing the recurrent monitoring survey, the findings from the first round of the recurrent monitoring survey. We'll briefly give you an overview of the methodology and the approach that's been adopted for this, and then we'll jump into presentation of the findings. As Karina mentioned, we've split this up. We're going to take breaks at different points to open it up for a question and answer period. And then finish up with discussing some of the implications of the first round findings for sort of moving forward with the RMS study, and then a session, question and answer session for the full group. So that's the plan for today. We've already done the introductions. Just a bit of background on this study. So this study was commissioned by the Bureau of Resilience and Food Security and the Center for Resilience in collaboration with the mission. The overall objective of this study was to basically look at how all of the programs operating in Northeast Nigeria were impacting resilience, and allowing households to strengthen their resilience capacities and thereby mitigate the negative effects of shocks and avert the need for further humanitarian assistance. So a bit of background on the design. Initially, the idea was that this would be a sort of a classic impact evaluation with treatment and control groups and measuring pre and post treatment. But after sort of discussion with all of the partners that involved in this, in the design of the study, for a number of reasons, we realized that was really not the most appropriate design. So we've moved to a slightly different design, which is what you can see on the right-hand side here, which is kind of a phased process where we started out with a qualitative initial assessment, and based on that, we have developed a mixed methods RMS study, which we'll be describing in more detail today and presenting the findings from that. And then following on that, there will be, based on the findings that come out of the RMS study, we will be developing a more in-depth qualitative inquiry around more specific research questions that all the stakeholders sort of agreed to. Another point to make about the background of this is that initially the plan was that this study was to be looking at the whole portfolio of resilience activities in Northeast Nigeria, which included integrated agricultural activity, the water for agriculture activity, and the rural resilience activity. As we were moving through this process, it became clear that the integrated agricultural activity and the water for agriculture activity were already quite far advanced in their implementation. And so the decision was made for this study to really focus on the rural resilience activity because it was just in the process of getting started implementation. Next slide, please. So the objectives, broadly speaking, the objectives of the study are to look at and measure resilience capacities in target communities of the RRA program. How RRA strategies and interventions affect these capacities over time, and then look at how these in turn affect well-being outcomes, particularly food security, in the context of many different kinds of shocks around conflict, displacement, and other kinds of things that are now becoming increasingly important shocks, price inflation, flooding, etc. So, well, okay. The overall objectives, I think we've already discussed, is basically to look at the impact of the programming approach. Another sort of aspect, another objective that has been given prominence is also to look at the impacts of displacement, and then particularly in the context of the Rural Resilience Program in terms of programs around market development activities. Next slide, please. So this chart here, I think, gives sort of a visual overview of the recurrent monitoring study, and how it's, well, first of all, it's a study that's where it's taking place over time, over the course of a year. It's a panel design, so we're collecting information from the same communities and the same households over time. And as you can see, the rounds are designed to capture information at different points in the agricultural cycle. Lean season, harvest, post-harvest, during agricultural growing season, and then into the lean season of the following year. We've also, you can see here that we've had to plan these rounds around sort of political events, elections, and so we've, as you can see here, we've organized so that we've avoided having the teams in the field during sensitive times during the political campaign cycles. And then the other thing that we see on this chart is another sort of shock that has become increasingly important, and that is the increasing inflation. So that's going to be another part of the context that we will be tracking. So I think this gives you sort of a good overview of the planning, the timing of the RMS rounds and how they line up with these different seasonal and political and economic factors. Next slide. Okay, so the recurrent monitoring survey, the design is so it has both quantitative and qualitative components. It will be conducted over 4 rounds. So we've completed the first round. We're presenting the findings from the first round, but it will be conducted over a 14-month period. As I mentioned, it's a panel sample of households and communities, so we'll be interviewing the same households in each round and it's going to the same communities. This has been in the design of this RMS survey in terms of the content, the tools, and so on, has been informed by information that we collected in the inception phase, which was a qualitative assessment. And again, we're addressing these key questions around these research questions are already identified about resilience of households and communities and what kinds of shocks they experience, with a particular focus on sort of the reality of conflict and insecurity and the resulting displacement of populations and how that affects communities and market systems in the project intervention area. It's as I sort of alluded to, this we've moved to a very what we hope is a very adaptive design, where we are sort of based on information that we collect in earlier rounds, tweaking, making adjustments in later data collection activities, and we're doing this in a good level of collaboration with both the AID partners and the implementing partner. And we're working with the survey team that we're working with on actually conducting the field work is binomial optimal, BOL. Okay, next slide, please. So the quantitative component is, again, it's panel design. A total of a little over 1,000 households were selected in a two-stage cluster design. So the intent is that this sample is to be representative of the population within the RA implementation area. There are both household and community questionnaires implemented, and these, we collect information about both household and community level information about resilience capacities, exposure to shocks, at the household level, outcome and recovery information. We have a particular focus because of the nature of the rural resilience activity. We have a particular focus on market actors in the marketing system that provide inputs or market outputs that provide the necessary support for improved farming practices, financial services as well. And then also because of there was during the time of the COVID, the Mercy Corps was also providing COVID assistance in the RRA implementation area. That was also there's also information collected about that. For the qualitative survey, there are 12 community sites were drawn from the clusters for where the quantitative survey was done. And over time, different participants will engage in these interviews to avoid fatigue. The selection was to try and capture a range of different types of intervention that were engaged in those communities. And there was a combination of focus groups that are both, separate male and female focus groups, and then a number of key informants, and again, focused particularly with key informants that are engaged in market systems. Next slide. Right, so what we're going to be doing now is presenting the findings, and in these three sort of broad categories. The first set of information we'll look at is around livelihoods and displacement, shocks, and food security. Then after that, the presentation of those findings, we'll have a brief question and answer session. Then we'll discuss information about market services, adoption of improved farming and business practices, again, a Q&A session, and then end up with talking about conflict mitigation, humanitarian assistance, and resilience, and then a Q&A session after that. Next slide. So that's an overview. I will now turn it over to Gita to jump into presenting the findings. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Before we jump into this first bucket of thematic area, just a small guidance note that we'll be drawing information from the community survey, the household survey, and the qualitative interviews. And generally speaking, all of the figures that are highlighted in blue tend to represent information coming in from the community survey. So they reflect availability or exposure to certain services. And generally all the figures in yellow indicate they're coming, those data are coming from the household surveys, and they are indicating actual adoption or use of those surveys. And all percentages here refer to the percentage of households. So either accessing a certain service, being exposed to it, or actually using it. So we'll move on. The first round of the RMS collected information on various different activities that households engaged in order to acquire food and income for their households in the 12 months prior to the survey. And what we learned is that on average, households participated in about 5 different types of livelihood activities, as illustrated in the figure to the right. And not surprisingly, the majority of households, about 72.5%, engage in own farming and crop production and sales. It is noteworthy that a little over 50% borrowed food or money in the past 12 months, and that also agricultural and non-agricultural wage labor, as well as livestock production, are important livelihood activities. Approximately 55% of households in the RA areas cultivated crops or raised livestock with the intention of selling or reselling them for income. And so we're identifying these households as being engaged in value chains. And we also identified approximately 18.8% of households as those operating a micro enterprise or a small to medium-sized agribusiness as well. And as we can see from these two figures, these are intended to illustrate the key crops or livestock commodities that households are producing. And the blue boxes indicate those that are targeted by the RRA program. And we can see that almost 2/3 of households are cultivating cowpeas and maize. Over 1/2 are cultivating sorghum and rice, and over 1/3 are growing groundnut. And about a little over 1/2, that's 52.1%, are raising goats, and over 1/3 are raising poultry, and 18.4% are raising sheep. Our findings on internal displacement and the context for internal displacement from the first round of the RMS corroborate or are consistent with what we learned from the initial assessment. What we did learn from the household survey is that about 6.7% of households moved to escape conflict or because of forced expulsions or camp closures. Most people were displaced by the Boko Haram insurgency, but some have also fled because of armed banditry and also to avoid farmer herder conflict. And what we learned that from the qualitative interviews, that in most sites during the insurgency, the elderly were killed, male youth were forced to join the insurgents, and female youth were kidnapped and forcefully married. Most of the IDPs, the internally displaced persons, were displaced between 2014 and 2017 due to Boko Haram, and they migrated to the host community mostly because that's where they have social networks, friends, ancestral connections, and others moved to the host communities for farming activities. And it was noted that IDPs are now residents within the community and are no longer living in camps. Generally speaking, the qualitative interviews indicate that there are no conflicts generally between the host communities and IDPs, and there were some accounts of strained relations, including stigma and mistrust, but those were generally, these disputes were resolved through dialogue. In terms of, it was noted that when the IDPs moved into the communities, they brought with them new crops, and they taught the host community on cultivating new crops. But there was also, it was noted that the influx of IDPs made goods and rent more expensive because of a competition for resources, including as well rent for land. The next set of slides focus on the top shocks that households were exposed to in the 12 months prior to the survey, as well as the coping strategies they adopted. As you can see here, the figure to the right illustrates the percentage of households experiencing top shocks in the past 12 months. And by top shocks, excuse me, we mean shocks that were experienced by 20% or more of households. The average number of shocks experienced by households was approximately 8.9 out of a total of 32. The most common shocks, as you can see, are price, weather, and disease related. So almost all households, 94%, reported experiencing increased food prices. We see a majority also experiencing increases in fuel and input prices, about 68% experiencing human disease, and this is excluding COVID, and it's referring specifically to the more seasonal diseases like cholera and malaria. It's to note here that the average score on the index of shock exposure, so that the index of shock exposure is measuring both whether the household experienced a shock, but also its perceived impact on household food and consumption. And the average score there for households was 44 out of a total of a maximum score of 256. The key informant interviews underscored our findings from the household survey, namely that the impact of flooding, disease outbreaks, inflation. Flooding was mentioned frequently by key informants and focus group discussants in all states. There were descriptions of how farms were washed away, harvests were destroyed, homes and property, and loss of lives in some cases. Disease outbreaks, including cholera, measles, and chickenpox, were mentioned in both female and male focus group discussions and community interviews. Key informant and focus group participants tended to attribute the price increases to the insurgency and discussed the difficulty of reaching markets and farmland because of fear of attacks, and that this in turn then creates supply constraints and contributes to price increases. Increased price of land was also discussed in most communities. Participants noted an increase in the cost of purchasing land. And this was related to, particularly noted, an increase in the price of farmlands that are close to residential areas because farmers have been reluctant to go far into the fields, and this has developed a preference for easier to access farmlands, and those prices have gone up due to the fear of traveling out for insurgency, terrorist attacks, and kidnappings. This has led to consequently, some farmers have been unable to afford land, so they've had to perform day labor. Others have had to work with smaller plots of land because they can't afford larger ones, and this has impacted their overall harvest. The key informants reported insurgency, theft, and kidnapping, as well as farmer-herder conflict. Typically, what the mentions of Boko Haram were in the context of past events, period between 2013 and 2017. And it was cited as the leading cause of displacement, impacting almost every aspect of life. And many had reported also the impact of the insurgency, as noted earlier, on market closures, as well as access to farmlands, and the fact that people are still reeling from the impacts of the shock from the decreased capacity of their livelihoods because of reduced capital, land, or labor, and also having to care for individuals due to the conflict. It was noted, and we picked up on this in the household survey, that there was a theft and armed robbery in the communities. The key informants shared and focus group discussions shared with us that this is mainly youth that have been engaged in the theft of food, phones, clothes, livestock, crops, and produce, and they tend to strike when household members are away in the fields or at prayer. And this was attributed, this rise in youth crime was attributed to unemployment, idleness, as well as hunger. In addition to that, kidnapping came up in the focus group discussions, many farmers have stopped farming in faraway areas because of fear of being kidnapped, and cases of kidnapping include kidnapping farmers as well as kidnapping children, and then demanding ransom be paid. Land disputes mainly occur from farmer-herder conflict. Herdsmen have been taking their cattle through the farms, especially when the farmers are engaged in other activities. The land disputes have been exacerbated by reduced access to land and land scarcity for some of the reasons we shared earlier, like the increased price of land, shortages of land due to population increase, and land quality issues around due to flooding and drought, as well as insecurity. Moving on to coping strategies. Figure here to the right illustrates the top coping strategies used by households who experienced a shock in the past 12 months. Not surprisingly, most households reduced their food consumption or diet quality. Others borrowed food or money, and we also diversifying livelihoods is a common coping strategy, as well as selling livestock. Key informants and focus group discussants also described various strategies and corroborated our findings coming out of the household survey, namely the reduction in the quality and quantity of food, including cutting down or out on protein, oil, and vitamin-rich foods, eating more filling foods like rice, maize, and reducing the consumption of more expensive processed foods like spaghetti. So this one male focus group discussant in Adamawa shares, our income has not increased, but the price of food has increased. So this has made it impossible for us to maintain what we formerly used to eat. Other coping strategies include purchasing inputs on credit, substituting chemical fertilizer with manure, and then switching to less input intensive crops, flood tolerant crops, as well as short harvest cycle crops, and adopting improved practices for dry season farming. But of course, and it is noteworthy that some of these coping strategies are actually positive, but there are also negative coping strategies such as selling land and assets. The impacts of the food prices are reflected in the levels of food insecurity. The survey collected information for the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, which measures the frequency of occurrence of food insecurity across 3 domains using 9 questions. The average score on the HFIAS was 10.1 out of a maximum of 27. And in turn, based on household scores, they are categorized into 4 levels of insecurity. And as we can see in the figure on the right, that the majority of households are food insecure. That's represented by the darker portions of the stack column. So we can see 57.5% of households are severely insecure and 22.8% are moderately insecure. This table illustrates the distribution of households by the incidence of food insecurity conditions. So not surprisingly, the majority of households, 74.1%, worry about not having enough food. We can see some of those findings also reflected here, the eating limited variety of foods, not preferred foods, smaller meals. But it is noteworthy that close to 1/2 of households, 48% of foods, 48% of households had no food to eat of any kind in the household, indicating that they had to perhaps borrow or or get that food, receive an in-kind donation of food to feed their households. Generally, recovery from shocks, except for human disease outbreaks, which tend to be seasonal, was low, and it's particularly those shocks that are market related. So that is represented by in the figure to the right. The percentages show households that perceive that they are able to, that believe they've recovered from their shocks. And we can see again that the shocks that are more systemic and ongoing, namely the price related shocks, households were less likely to recover from those. And this brings us to the end of the presentation of the first set of findings, and we can open it up now for questions. And generally the questions follow, we're taking this kind of general approach. We'd like to know if any of the results surprised you, and if so, which ones, and also what implications you think these findings would have for your programming strategy.
And please feel free to use the Zoom reaction section to raise your hand. You can also pop your comments and questions in the chat. Give everyone a moment to let things percolate. There's a lot of really interesting information we just saw. All right, Danielle.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks to the Tango team. I'm always intrigued to see these kinds of findings, because I really feel like it pulls the whole picture together and gives you a moment to stop and actually think about, that connection between exposure and the well-being outcomes. A lot is standing out to me, and I have a lot of questions, and I think it'll bear the need to really sit down and contextualize these with the team. But a few things in particular, one, and I suppose this is not necessarily too surprising, but there's probably some surprising reasons why this might be, and this is where I'd love to dig in, is just to really see this high level of food insecurity. Like it's no surprise, I suppose, and it's something that we've been looking at for a while, that looking at the long effects of COVID, plus all of these shocks that you've laid out, the price inflation, the ongoing issues around access and insecurity, the flooding now, and then of course, just like the other issues, seasonal shocks, that all of that's kind of coming together. And what I'm wondering and looking at is sort of like, we've got this continued high food insecurity, or maybe this is a big spike. I want to go back and take a look at what did this look like a few years ago. But given sort of the other types of positive trends that we've been seeing around, adoption of strategies and, use of savings or access to different services. It struck me also at the beginning, we're talking about most people having exposure to at least 5 different services, which I think is actually quite good integration. So what's kind of breaking down? Are we looking at a situation where it's just this added kind of congruence of these shock effects are just really too much for the types of interventions that we're bringing, or it's overwhelming? Do we need to look at some additional responses to support kind of this moment where it looks like a lot is really coming together to cause such a dip in food insecurity? So one of my reactions, just kind of surprised that food insecurity number is so high. And then the other one that really strikes me is more of like a longer term strategic question. And this is around these displacement trends continuing, and looking at, I think in the last session we held, one of the findings that was shared was that the original displacement happened quite a long time ago, when people are now really settled into these host communities. And so now we're seeing some of these other trends around land cost. It's positive to see that communities mostly didn't report tensions around that, except in some cases. I'm questioning now, sort of like for the Northeast, where do we look at to really understand the right holistic package that's going to start to address these trends that are going to turn into, new challenges. So for land access issues, what does that mean in terms of economic opportunities, and what parts of market systems interventions are going to really bring the most to bear? Are we looking at really strengthening kind of different sources of income across the spectrum, so that we're really cognizant of how these new trends are going to play out for specific populations, where potentially we're not looking at the ability to farm long-term for all of them? And we really do need to upgrade some of those other opportunities in the market system. So those are just a couple that stood out to me. I guess overall, this really does reinforce that the Northeast is a really tough, it's a really tough environment, and people certainly are dealing with a lot. And at the same time, there's a lot of strategies that people have been using here, and you can see that some of those are really coming into play with, with the shock recovery slide on the last one that you shared, Gita. So I'll stop there and see what else people have to say.
Thank you, Gita. Before we get to John's question, or thank you, Danielle. Gita, Mark, do you have reactions to Danielle's comments?
Hi, Karina. Sure. I guess we'll just start with the note on the estimates for food insecurity. They do seem to make sense in the context of all the other findings, particularly around the market-related shocks. So it's not just increases in food prices, but it's also increase in prices of inputs and fuel, and that is impacting the ability of farmers and businesses to be able to purchase inputs, to make the investments in their businesses, to have production at the scale that's required to be able to reach the markets and sell their produce. And so it is all coming together also with the seasonal impacts of the flooding. So in that respect, the food insecurity findings fit into that broader picture that we're seeing at this point. It will be interesting to look across the next few waves to see how that changes, perhaps. And yes, absolutely, there are positive coping strategies that we're seeing, but as we will see in the next set of findings, that households are participating in VSLAs, they're saving, some are able to access loans, but again, there are these kind of systems levels constraints coming from access to markets and service providers that impact production and impact businesses. So something just to keep in mind there. Mark, is there, Mark, Stephanie, others, Charles, Robin, if there's anything you'd like to also add, please do jump in. Over.
Yeah, thanks. I guess one thing I would say is, well, as Gita has already pointed out, I think the questions you raise are certainly important ones, and I think they are questions that we need to keep in mind as we look at the trends over the coming rounds. This is a snapshot, and by the way, Stephanie has reminded us to remind all of you that this was done during the lean season, right? So there is sort of a seasonal explanation for some of the low level of food security. But I think the broader point is that yes, these are certainly questions that we need to have in front of mind as we look at the trends for over the following rounds. Over.
Thank you both. John.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the presentation so far. Really interesting stuff. I had two small questions. There was a slide dedicated to conflict and displacement, and then the subsequent slide kind of graphed out the shocks and stresses, and that slide didn't mention conflict and displacement. Is it that they weren't referred to often by respondents as shocks of significance, or is somehow your team considering conflict and displacement as different than the other shocks that's shown there? And then the second question, this might actually be addressed down the road, but I think an interest for USAID and for the implementer is there is a design for the program, and it is based on some understanding of the risk environment that exists there. I think this is illuminating the risk environment much more. Are we going to be seeing to what extent the design is kind of properly aligned with the risks that people are facing, and eventually seeing if is the right mix, different mix would be better, et cetera, kind of a project evaluation kind of view. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Gita, Mark? Oh, Gita, we can't hear you for some reason.
I'm muted. I'm double muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So on the question of whether we asked about whether the household survey inquired about conflict, we did. And just it's not showing up in this illustration because just, there's so much we can put on a slide. We're highlighting the top shocks, and we're using a threshold of 20%. I can, off the top of my head, remember the percentage of households that reported conflict, but we do have that, and we report it in the expanded table in the report. But I think maybe something worth noting here is that what we did pick up on the survey and was corroborated through the focus group discussions and the key informant interviews were kind of those after effects from conflict or resulting from the preventative measures that were taken to mitigate against future attacks that were impacting things like market access and so forth. But we can certainly provide those statistics about percent reporting conflict. We didn't necessarily ask about displacement as a shock, but we did capture it in the survey in terms of asking households, one, whether they moved to the area because of conflict or forced closures or expulsion, and if the household itself didn't entirely move, whether they were hosting individuals that moved. But that's something we can certainly think about in terms of how we tweak the tool for the next round. Over.
Thanks, Gita. And we have.
This is Tim. I just wanted to follow up on what Gita said. I think what's really important here is even though most of the displacement due to Boko Haram happened between 13 and 17, the consequences of that displacement and people's ability to cope with that conflict are the consequences that are still impacting their livelihoods. So when we think about a conflict setting like this, it's the way that people try to manage that conflict by avoiding it. And that has a lot to do with the way that they access markets, the way that they access inputs, the way that they access their farmland. All of these things are reactions to that conflict. So even though the conflict might not be happening at this second, the consequences of the conflict has influenced everything that's going on in their lives. And so that's important to take into account here. Over.
Thanks, Tim. We're going to squeeze in one last question. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Corinna, and thank you, Gita and Mark, for the excellent presentation. I had two specific questions. First, I was wondering, just to dive more into conflict and displacement, I think we'd expected to see kind of increased displacement and increased influx of IDPs as Borno is closing the IDP camps there. And I'm more removed, of course, from the context, so I may be misunderstanding, but I was curious if that has come out, or if not, why that is not, or sorry, if you've seen that to some extent, or have heard about it, but have not actually seen an increased influx. And then my second question, and this is kind of building off of one that Danielle dropped in the chat there, is just around sort of, you know, any positive deviance of households or communities, and I think Danielle's message asks about you know, the ones that are remaining only mildly food insecure, and I'd also be curious, you know, the same question: are there communities or are there groups of households that are still managing land access and access to affordable inputs more easily or better than others? Thank you, and over.
Thanks, Dan. Geeta or Mark?
Dan, that's a great, great observations and great questions. I think I'm going to start with the one on positive deviance. Those cases that are mildly insecure or secure in the households that are able to manage land access or access to inputs. So that's something we're interested in delving more deeply into in terms of what is the profile of these households or businesses look like? What are they doing? What makes them unique? For this presentation, we didn't really look at things. You know, we can certainly look at certain cross tabulations across these various different measures, but it's also something we have an eye on to look at and build questions around for the next round, because we are interested in also understanding, you know, what works, what does it look and for whom. On the question of increased displacement, we certainly, you know, we don't have a prior necessarily data point to compare to, but I will turn that piece over to Charles and Robin if there is something you'd like to add in terms that came up on displacement and IDPs that we didn't cover in the survey. Over.
For the most part, we heard that IDPs were really absorbed into the main communities, so there wasn't as much conflict in recent times. They were given land, by original community members, and so but I don't remember hearing anything about recent IDPs coming in. There wasn't much talk about that.
I second that what Robin said. We did see that some focus groups did mention an influx in IDPs, but this seemed to refer to a longer period of time, a gradual increase in numbers. I suspect that we were interviewing people in the communities and not the camps itself, which might lend itself to some of the explanation why we didn't capture IDP camps themselves. And so a lot of the IDPs mentioned that they were already, as Robin said, kind of settled in the communities. They had already purchased land or were able to rent land. A lot of them had their own shelter at this point in time. Something that will be interesting to see as we move forward, as we expect more camp closures to occur. Perhaps we will pick up a shift in what we're seeing now.
Thank you, Charles and Robin. All right, so that concludes our first Q&A session. If you think of anything later, feel free to pop it in the chat anytime, and we will get back to the presentation.
Thank you, Karina. This next bucket of findings revolves around market services and improved farming and business practices. Excuse me. To recap, the RA program, through its market systems development approach and in partnership with private sector market actors, is supporting a range of pull and push activities that are intended to support the recovery and economic growth. And what we've done through our quantitative component, the community survey and household survey, as well as the qualitative interviews, is try to get an understanding of the availability of those market services. So specifically financial services, input market services like livestock services, agricultural extension services, business advisory and farming services, as well as output market services like linkages to transportation with aggregators, off-takers, and marketing groups, as well as training, and also to look at the actual adoption or use of these practices. And in addition to that, to understand the context around that, and particularly applying the analytical lens of looking at what are the supply side barriers perhaps, or opportunities, incentives, disincentives, and also trying to look at on the demand side, what are the barriers or opportunities in terms of social networks, knowledge, know-how, access to resources like capital, credit, labor, and land, as well as people's perceptions and attitudes. In terms of the availability of financial services, we learned from the community surveys that about 1/3 of households reside in communities with borrowing and or saving services available within 5 kilometers. And this is referring specifically to the provision of credit or savings through banks, microfinance institutions, VSLA credit groups, and cooperatives. As you can see in the figure to the right, that illustrates the percentage of households living in those communities providing those services by provider. And it also illustrates other types of providers, such as money lenders and shops and merchants. So we know that most households took out a cash loan. About 72% of households took out a cash loan in the past 12 months. And as we can see here in the figure, that the overwhelmingly borrowing occurs through informal channels. So about 92.8% of households that borrowed cash took that from a relative or a friend. But we also note that we can see that VSLAs, credit groups, cooperatives are also important vehicles for securing cash loans. So about 8.7% that took out a cash loan did so through a VSLA. And we can also see here 4.7% for banks. About 20% of households save cash, and banks are the primary vehicles for depositing their savings. We can see about 1/2 of households, 46.4% deposited their savings in a bank. VSLAs, again, in cooperatives, a common platform for depositing savings. It's worth noting here that we learned from the qualitative interviews that that banks don't actually have a physical presence in the communities. And so these transactions are done through point of service at vendors. The focus group discussions corroborated the importance of VSLA and cooperatives for depositing savings and accessing loans. And VSLAs follow kind of a typical structure of having a general savings fund for business investments, startups, and farming, as well as a social fund to be used for emergencies and life events. It was noted there is a relatively high or sense of a high female participation in VSLAs, and that in some cases, women were forming their own VSLAs because they felt they were not being brought into the decision-making on how to use household savings. And it also gave them an opportunity to share in livelihood activities with other women. So for example, women could deposit their savings in order to then purchase livestock, and 1 or 2 women would be responsible for raising the livestock. It was also noted that there were some IDP-only VSLAs that emerged either because of lack of vacancies in existing VSLAs, or perhaps a lack of trust between the IDPs and the host community. There was it was observed that there's a general uptake in VSLA membership that discussants attributed to the efforts of NGOs over the past few years, and also an interest in basically, because of the current circumstances and volatility of the market and desire for financial protection, to be able to have savings and to deposit them somewhere. However, the limited nature of the VSLAs, because they are membership based, means that only loans can only be dispersed to members rather than the whole community. So that defines kind of their reach. As noted earlier, there's sometimes there are issues of mistrust that arise, concerns of individuals being unable to pay or repay or squandering the loan, and also potentially mistrust between new arrivals to the community that are not necessarily familiar with the group. It was noted that that any loan or payment disputes are settled by the leader of the group, and sometimes the community leader is brought in to assist in resolving those issues as well. And that the COVID-19 lockdown did impact the ability of these groups to meet early 2020. In terms of the barriers to accessing loans through formal banking services, we wanted to look in and better understand what are those barriers. And to that, and one of those barriers was information and misinformation. So on one hand, close to 1/2 of households received information or knew about where to borrow, and mostly got that information from friends and family. But we learned from the focus group discussions that there's quite a bit of potentially misinformation about the loan process or the expectations, for example, that loans are freebies from the government, and sometimes potentially mistrust, particularly around interest rates. The key informant interviews and focus group discussions highlighted some other challenges, not surprisingly, around loan size. Some farmers felt that the loan size that they were approved for could not meet commercial needs. On the other hand, there was a sense that it wasn't maybe lucrative for banks to be offering or servicing these loans to these communities because they're small loans. The households also felt that the loan conditions and terms weren't favorable, didn't meet their needs, cited high interest rates, anywhere between 29 to 41%, the difficult short repayment period, the requirement for a guarantor, the requirement to have a business registration certificate or national identity number, as well as bureaucratic delays in processing applications and dispersing funds. There's also a sense that banks really didn't understand borrowers' needs and concerns. And on the flip side, banks were concerned about the credit worthiness of borrowers in these communities and their potential to default on loans. Moving on to the availability of markets, as we can see here from the light portion of the stacked columns, is that almost all households, 97%, live within 5 kilometers of a livestock market or a market where they could sell their agricultural goods and that were accessible year round. We'll note, though, however, that approximately 25% of households have to travel more than 5 kilometers to get to input markets. And that is represented by the dark blue portion of the stacked column to the far right. The key informant interviews did cite and refer to some security-related challenges accessing markets, some of which we've discussed, like the Boko Haram attacks and threats, bandit attacks at marketplaces and roads leading into the markets, as well as exclusions on bans on reaching on entering markets for individuals that are suspected of suspicious interactions or dealings with foreigners, and also market shutdowns related to election and post-election violence. In terms of the availability of targeted input services, we can see here from the figure that livestock services, and that's represented by the left, by the stacked column on the left, livestock services tend to be more widely available and accessible compared to agricultural extension services. So we can see the dark blue portion again indicates percentage of households without access or having to go, in this case, more than 5 kilometers. When it comes to agricultural extension services, that's affecting 63% of households. And what we learned from the community survey is that the common reasons that those services could not be accessed had to revolved around cost, lack of supplies, or the service providers, namely the agricultural agents, either not being available or being just being too busy, having a high caseload. In terms of specific services provided, where livestock services are available, as we can see here from the figure to the left, that antibiotics, vaccination, health advice, and deworming services are universally available. But with respect to agricultural extension services, those tend to be information-only services, as you can see by the 94.3%. In terms of the actual use of input market services, as we can see here, among those targeted suite of input market services linkages that RA is supporting, the use of livestock services is the highest. That's 31% of households that rear livestock used livestock services in the past 12 months. That's not surprising in light of the statistics we just reviewed in terms of the availability of those services. The other types of input market linkages are used by a small percentage of households. That's referring to the business development services, precision farming advisory services, and financial advisory services. That's not surprising, perhaps, in a traditional farming context. And also the use of agricultural extension services here at 2.4%, also perhaps not surprising given kind of the issues the limited availability that we shared in the accessibility of those services. So recall that approximately 2/3 of households are not within 5 kilometers of ag extension services. And given kind of the security concerns, traveling, the cost of fuel and transportation, that all exacerbates access to those services that are farther away from the community. The key informant interviews and focus group discussions with business owners highlighted some of the barriers to the availability and use of services and inputs. Those include the lack of sufficient capital to be able to stock up on farm inputs, and inflation has made this problem worse. There's also the issue of the late delivery of inputs from the factories, notably improved seeds. So one key informant male in Borno shares that these farmers sometimes even deposit money in advance to get the seeds. Whenever we have a delay in supply, most of them collect back their money to buy the seeds from somewhere else. Lack of fertilizer due to the military ban on the use of urea is also been a problem. The government has banned it because of the fear of bomb making, and this ban is enforced by the army. We learned that the communities still buy it on the black market, but it's expensive and almost tripled in price. So another powerful quote here perhaps is from a focus group discussant, male focus group discussant in Borno, that the government has asked us to go and farm, but there is no way a farmer can carry fertilizer from his house market and take it to the farm without being harassed by the military. Another key point was the lack of staff to provide extension services to all their farmers, especially after NGO support has ended. Again, this quote here perhaps is very telling. We had 7 extension agents that provided these services. After the contract with RRA ended, 3 of our extension workers had to leave their jobs because there was no remuneration, and our organization was unable to pay the extension agents. And as discussed earlier, the high transportation costs are also making it expensive for service providers to travel to and from the farms. In terms of the use of output market services or linkages with output market services, the figure to the topmost figure or illustrates the percentage of households that are participate in producer and marketing groups as well as cooperatives. And we can see that that ranges between about 2.2 to 12.2%. And that includes all of the households in the RA areas. The figure in the bottom represents actual use of transportation services, or selling, for example, through traders, aggregators, and off-takers. It's noteworthy, though, that that these statistics refer specifically to those households that are engaged in value chains. So that's why the sample size on that is smaller. And we can see that about 1/3 sell their products through traders, village agents, or grain aggregators. And about between 3 to 14% are selling their livestock products through off-takers. And just 6.2% have access to transportation services. In terms of MSD market systems development topically related training, so this includes things like training on how to form savings and loan groups, how to start up a business, improve production practices, as well as financial literacy. What we learned was, with the exception of training on improved crop production, exposure was generally moderate to low. So exposure means that households are in communities that received this training. In terms of actual percentages of households themselves receiving that was ranged between anywhere from 1 to 4%. Also, when it comes to accessing information, which is critical for enhancing, among other factors, enhancing production and business growth, we learned that between 1/4 to 1/2 of households received information or knew about topics like where to borrow money, improved production, business and investment opportunities, but that the primary source here tended to be relatives, friends, and neighbors, and underscored really the importance of social networks in these communities. The following couple of slides are illustrating the adoption of improved agricultural technologies and practices in the past 12 months. As we can see here, the most widely used is fertilizer application, but we will note that that does include things like compost and manure, just in light of what we've heard about access to chemical fertilizer, but that is relatively high at 63.1%. Proper plant spacing, rainwater harvesting, and cropping systems as well, used by approximately 1/2 or more of households. It's noteworthy that the use of improved seeds, that's the second bar from the bottom, is at 11.2%, which perhaps again is not surprising given what we've learned about access and availability issues when it comes to agricultural extension services and business being able to stock up on improved seeds. In terms of improved storage practices, the most widely used among crop producers, 56% are using the PICS bags and grain bags, and about 1/4 are using sealed or airtight containers and traditional storage. We can see also, when it comes in terms of improved livestock practices and technologies, not surprisingly, majority are using vaccinations and antibiotics. That's consistent with our findings on the availability of those types of supplies and services. And about 1/3 or more are using deworming and animal health advice as well. That concludes our second round of findings. And again, we'd like to open it up with questions, anything surprising, any implications. And we're also specifically interested with thoughts on, after this presentation, perhaps vulnerable market actors on whom to focus, and what we can do to strengthen market performance in this context of conflict-related constraints and general price inflation.
We will start off with you, Jay Anderson. I see you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much for the slides. This was just chock full of information. So I have 2 questions. One is, we had an event under Real 2 back in January with Jasmine and Mercy Corps colleagues on resilience and protracted crises. And one of the takeaways was about how VSLAs don't just provide these economic benefits, they actually can really enhance social sources of resilience. So social capital, women's empowerment, and social cohesion. And so I'm curious if any of that bubbled up for you in your, it didn't show up on the slide on VSLAs, but I don't know if there's anything that you could elaborate on that. I'd also be curious in the future, one, if it didn't really bubble up, kind of that positive deviant dynamic of, are there certain conditions under which that's more likely, you know, and is there something to learn about that? And then on the social cohesion front, those dynamics around IDPs maybe setting up their own VSLAs, maybe sometimes being involved, like positive deviance and anything around that to me is just super, super interesting. And then, yeah, and so that's one bucket, because it would just really build on past Real 2 work, which to me is super interesting. And then for this question of, you know, like what can be done to strengthen market performance, I was noticing it seems like capitalizing small businesses and traders might be a really impactful approach. I remember that was really prominent in the Spark evidence review that Mercy Corps colleagues participated in for protracted conflict settings. So I'm curious if, like, one, that is something rural resilience is doing at all, and if that's something that's popped up as an idea for folks. Over.
Thank you. Passing it over to Gita or Mark or Charles.
As the qualitative team are reviewing their information, I think Jesse, I think that your questions are definitely very interesting, and I think we need to definitely consider how to address those questions about, number one, the sort of the social effects of VSLA and other project supported groups, and then also the question about how displaced populations may or may not also sort of engage in those kinds of activities. I think those are definitely questions that we want to put on our list of things that we want to follow up on in more detail in the later rounds, and you know, in the more in-depth analyses. So thanks for those comments.
Thank you, Anderson. On the VSLA point, it was interesting that we did see we saw that we both had sort of working cooperative groups and VSLAs, and sometimes they were almost as one and the same from the focus group discussions. For example, there are some mentions of the displaced people forming their own savings group, but this group was not only a savings group, it was also, they mentioned that they shared information on how to farm. They mentioned that this group also sometimes works with the community leader in distributing benefits whenever beneficiaries are being selected. So there's certainly some interesting findings that we're discovering there. And also on that note with a women's group, I believe Gita mentioned it, but essentially there was one comment from a focus group where women mentioned that they sometimes felt left out of decision-making, or that due to gender dynamics, they felt more autonomy over the savings if it was a women's only savings group. And so it was a way for them also to empower each other and encourage their businesses. So these women's savings groups were sometimes mentioned as specifically trying to empower women-led businesses, either through food processing or, as you mentioned, the livestock investment. And it'll be interesting to, look at this moving forward, the social capital development as Mark just said as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. All right. Oh, Danielle, over to you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. A couple things standing out to me again, and to Jesse's point on the VSLAs, one thing I'm interested in here, well, I guess overall on financial services, I'm really curious to understand if the borrowing practices are the same between men and women. So there's something to dig into here, which is around the importance of the BSLAs, the importance of borrowing practices in driving kind of household use of different services potentially, and then understanding what consumption patterns actually look like at the household level. So again, if we're seeing this really high food insecurity issue persist, and just how kind of overwhelming the shocks are for households and all these other systems level issues that we've been talking about, like digging in a bit into how is that household economy really working. And I think just the role of like local credit and borrowing and driving some of the decisions, and who is engaged in those practices in the household is really going to make a difference to understanding, what are the factors really influencing household nutrition, like choices around consumption, and some of those concerns that came out in the previous set of slides. So it just strikes me because one of the interesting things we're seeing in Somalia with some of the resilience analysis there, again, on social connections, to your point, Jesse, is around, households choosing to forego meeting their own consumption needs so that they can preserve their social connection with traders in the market from whom they're borrowing regularly to make sure that in the future they can get what they need to cover their food needs. So it's like short-term consumption shocks to like preserve longer-term access to food. So I would love to dig into that a bit more. And then the other thing that's just sticking out to me, I guess, is, one of the hallmarks of working on using the MSD approach is really trying to address a lot of those supply side constraints, which are working on why these services aren't accessible in last mile markets, and trying to really understand the business model behind them, and particularly the issue of cost in making that service, an economic incentive for market actors to really target that population. And I think that when we look at some of these findings around availability of agricultural extension services or market information being there, or even like the higher use around livestock services, it bears the need to really look in, to understand, like, are there bright spots where we do see higher availability, and what does that say about the business model behind it, and what are some of the incentives? So I definitely think that we're in, like, the resilience programs are in it for the long game, and it's really trying to understand that deeper dynamic, so that there's not necessarily like a short-term access to something like we saw with that quote with the extension agents, but like what is really driving that systemic change over time. Sorry, one last thing that I'm interested in here is the importance of livestock, and again, like food insecurity or food security, if I frame it positively. So the main types of livestock people are farming are the small ruminants, typically managed by women. Most of the services available are the livestock services that are being used. And again, we're seeing kind of the food insecurity issues at the household level. So what's going on with that? Like, are we seeing, I'm assuming that those small ruminants are mostly being used for fattening. And we saw like 55%, I think, were commercially oriented around, selling some of their produce for sales. I think it's also worthwhile to like really dig into that livestock question and understand, what's the dynamic between who's raising the livestock, who's accessing the services, which from our own data and the program level, we know are women, and then what does that income coming into the household look like for the borrowing, the household economy, how they're borrowing against that, and then where does that actually translate into food security? And is there something really potentially positive happening that we could reinforce if we see where that's working well? I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Danielle. Tango team, if you could please respond to Danielle's wonderful reactions in the chat. And we have one last section to get through, so we'll get started on that. But thank you so much.
Yeah, great set of comments, Danielle. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on, and then most certainly get back to you. Okay, so this last bucket of findings revolves around conflict mitigation, humanitarian assistance, and resilience. In terms of conflict mitigation and peace building, just to recap, perhaps some of the highlights we touched upon earlier, that broadly, when it comes to the IDP host community, little conflict was noted between host community and IDP, and those tend to be resolved through dialogue. Most of there is some conflict around land disputes, which is not surprising, between farmers and herders, and we discussed some of the approaches that farmers were taking to mitigate against that. But what did come out in the qualitative interviews, that most communities, their reaction to this diversity of security concerns and issues, including kidnapping, armed robbery, was to form these vigilante groups comprised of youth and older men. We also learned on the quantitative side, that both from the community questionnaire and the household surveys, that most households, so almost 3/4, were receiving information about conflict or security issues. But in terms of membership in conflict management and peace building committees, or participation in conflict management trainings, those were ranged between relatively low. They're under 5%. The most commonly available forms of formal assistance, and here we're referring to assistance from the government or NGOs, were conditional cash transfers, agricultural programming or inputs, educational assistance, or school feeding and drinking water. But we note that few households, 9%, actually received formal support. And the most common types were emergency cash assistance, conditional cash transfers, and emergency food assistance. We also looked specifically at COVID-19 transfers, and we know from the community surveys that between 1/4 and 1/2 of households were in communities that received some form of COVID assistance. That could be cash or in kind, and it's illustrated here in the figure to the right. So we can see about 52.9% of households resided in communities that were targeted for cash assistance. 26.6% resided in communities that were targeted with in-kind support like training and equipment, and 20.4% for cash loans, and so on. But we'll note from the household survey, though, that the majority of households, 95.6%, said they did not receive any COVID-19 assistance. And this could be perhaps underreporting from households, or also could be a function of the reference period. The reference period here was the past 12 months. There's a diversity of NGO activity in the RRA areas. Multiple NGOs were reported and came into the community about 3 years following the insurgency, and providing a suite of interventions around agriculture, health, nutrition, and WASH. This ranged from training to equipment, inputs, and grants, and targeted host members, as well as the host community, as well as IDPs and women, men, youth, and children. Most of the communities reported having benefited from the interventions. There were some reports of that the receipt of these interventions were creating some sort of fissures or disputes. For example, some felt that there was favoritism in the distribution of benefits. Some men felt that they were being excluded in decisions that affect their wives. And there was also concerns about people crowding at distribution points, and that causing some casualties. Moving on now to household resilience capacities. The next set of slides will review household resilience. And we are using 3 measures: here of household resilience capacities, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative resilience capacities. To recap, these measures are computed from components or sub-indicators and indices. The relative weights or importance of these components are based on the results of factor analysis, which really picks up the strength of the statistical correlations. And then those components that have a higher correlation receive a higher weight. It is noteworthy that the weights are fixed at the baseline, or in this case, the first round, and then the same weights are applied in subsequent rounds to facilitate comparisons. But that we are aware that the relative importance of these components can change over time, particularly as a result of the targeted interventions. Absorptive resilience capacity is reflecting the ability of households to deal with a shock or a stressor, and includes both positive coping strategies as well as preventative measures that would help them prepare for shocks to come. The absorptive resilience capacity index is comprised of 8 sub-indicators that are listed in the table here to the right. Also illustrated are the factor loadings in the first column, and that is indicates the strength of the association with the underlying measure here, which is the absorptive capacity, and values close to 1 tend to represent a strong association. So, and we also can see to the column to the right indicates the average score on that component. So for example, looking here at the absorptive capacity, we see that asset ownership has a factor loading of 0.7, which means that it is strongly correlated with households' ability to deal with the impacts of a shock. But we see that the average score is 12, and 12 out of a maximum score of 66. So the values within the parentheses indicate the range. So the minimum and maximum values of that score. Asset ownership here is picking up things like household assets like appliances and furniture, of course, productive assets like farming equipment, as well, and farming and agricultural land, as well as livestock assets. Bonding social capital and the availability of and access to insurance are also strong correlates of the absorptive capacity of households. And bonding social capital is what that's picking up is the ability of households to basically provide and receive support in times of distress from members within their own community. We can see that's relative. We've used this color coding scheme to indicate low, medium, high based on tercile cutoffs for the scale itself. So we can see here the bonding social capital component goes from 0 to 6, and the average score is a 3.2. Access to insurance and availability of that, we didn't really discuss that earlier, but availability of insurance, crop and livestock insurance is very low, and less than 1%, about 0.3% of households actually use it. And so, but this is an important correlate of absorptive capacity. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. And of course, we can always come back if there are specific questions. There's a lot of perhaps information here. In terms of the adaptive resilience capacity, that is measuring the ability of households to manage their resources and make proactive and informed choices to prepare for future shocks and to adapt to them. And that is comprised of 10 sub-indicators. And here again, we see that asset ownership is also an important predictor. It's the second row from the top. Information exposure is also very strongly correlated with adaptive capacity. The score there is, the average score is a 9 out of a maximum of 20. And what that is picking up is whether households knew about or received information, critical information like information on markets, prices, weather conditions. And also, not surprisingly, livelihood diversification is important for households' adaptive capacity, as are linking social capital and bridging social capital. moving on to transformative resilience capacity. So this subcomponent, what it's really looking at and measuring is on the systems level, the resources, governance, institutions that create an enabling environment that can either bolster, promote, or limit households' capacity to respond to shocks and stressors. And this is typically comprised of 15 sub-indicators. And here we can see that access to basic services, local government responsiveness, infrastructure, agricultural extension services, livestock services, those are the most closely related in this context, or correlated with transformative capacity. Availability, just to unwrap that a little bit, access to, or excuse me, availability of basic services is picking up things like roads, schools, health clinics, protection. Local government responsiveness is intended to pick up the extent to which the local government responded to requests from the community to improve their assets or services. This could be requests for improvements to roads, schools, health clinics. We can see availability of infrastructure that's highlighted in green, indicating a relatively high average score, given that it's of 3.6 on a scale with a maximum value of 4. And that's picking up things like the availability of a phone network, roads, a primary school. And then we can see here, we've talked at length about the availability of agricultural extension services and livestock services, and we noted that those were moderate to low, but also critical for the transformative resilience capacity. And with that, I think we're entering here our last round of discussions around the results. I'll turn it over to you, Karina. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. All right, Jesse, we'll pass it over to you.
I've finally learned the trick of just raising your hand earlier to get in line first. So anyway, thank you so much for that. Again, I have a bunch of kind of questions, comments. I thought this was super interesting. One is I was struck that there isn't really tension between IDPs and host communities. And I think it would be interesting to dig into why that is, and kind of even though it wouldn't really be a positive, I guess it's a positive deviant thing globally, because normally there is tension between these groups. And so I'd be curious, are they a similar ethnic group? Is there just a consistent level of assets, or what about it leads to not really, a little bit of mistrust, but otherwise not really having too much of that tension. And then the next bucket, also goes into a lot of the other work that's been done under Wheel 2 with Mercy Corps, because I saw that line about favoritism and distribution being an issue. And I was just very interested in the potential to be unpacking that and what exactly is going on there. With the social connections work, we've had a couple, so between South Sudan and Yemen, and then our most recent Resilience Links event, we've been talking about how can external intervention disrupt local social networks? Also then, what do we know in addition to the external assistance folks are receiving? I know we have a question about remittances, so I didn't see that on a slide. I don't know how remittances factor in other kinds of social support, just leaning into more of what's going on with other kinds of informal social protection at the community level. And then what's going on with that favoritism and distribution? Is that, is there a local committee that is determining, supporting NGOs and determining who gets what, and that's where it is? Or is it just people's sense of worthiness of who got what and what's going on there? So anyway, I think the favoritism and distribution bucket is just super interesting to think about down the line. And then the next question I had, it seemed like, but you can tell me, with transformative capacities, it seemed like roads actually appeared in a couple of those top couple. Like I would kind of bucket them. It was like basic services, infrastructure. Maybe there was another one, but it seems like roads were just kind of a key part to all of that. And I'm wondering if in the qualitative data, your insights, if that's really it, like in some of these tough contexts, because for instance, I know this comes up when we're talking about South Sudan, and it's like transformative capacities can be at a point where we're talking about basic services that really make the difference in someone being able to access markets, have that the key kind of mobility that you need to just start having more life opportunities and chances. And so I'm wondering if you feel like you're identifying within transformative capacities what those kind of like lowest common denominator must-haves are that seem to be getting certain folks to have more opportunities. So yeah, I'll pause there. Over for me.
Thank you, Jessie. A lot of great comments there. Tango team, have any reactions?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Again, I think that you raised some really interesting, sort of deeper questions that I think it's something that we can look into even with the data that we have from this first round about, for example, looking at within the transformative capacity and within sort of those broader categories of infrastructure and services, what are really the key specific components. And I think that to a certain we can look into that more deeply, and even in this first round. But more importantly, I think that those are questions that we can address more or focus on more in the later rounds. So yeah, thanks for those comments.
All right, I'll pass the mic over to Dan.
Great. Thank you, Corinna. So my question, I think I'm sorry, it's still a little early morning for me, so I'm still kind of I'm muddling my way through the different resilience indices. My first thought in kind of seeing the relative scores of the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative indices was this is kind of what I'd expect to see from a program that takes a systems development approach in a very fragile and conflict affected setting where we're seeing my initial interpretation was that the transformative indices were a bit stronger, and that kind of shows some of the system level interventions may be working there, or at least there's greater potential in the system, but that at the individual or individual household and community levels, their resources are also just being exhausted by the combination of conflict, transforming into COVID, or sorry, not transforming, but being followed by COVID, and then by the food, fuel, and fertilizer crisis, along with weather shocks and floods. So my first question, I guess, is even going that the transformative capacities are stronger than absorptive and adaptive. Is that a fair interpretation of this, or is it better not to try to compare these indices at all? And just any other comments you have along that line. And then my second question is also, in looking at this, is there a feasible exercise of tying the specific components of the indices back to the kind of RRA activities that might be targeting them, or do you think that mapping exercise becomes too complex and too infeasible, particularly given the wide range of activities that are being conducted? Thank you. Over.
Thanks, Dan. Looks like Mark is ready to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I guess a couple of points. You can't really look at the factor loadings within one component. You can't look at those numbers meaningful across the different capacities, right? Those are all scores that really sort of measure, sort of generally they say, how does this particular component relate to the aggregate index? In this case, like we're looking at transformative capacity. So, but it doesn't say anything about sort of the relative weight of this component, relative to other components in other capacities. So, you can't sort of say, well, availability of basic services is 0.9, and that's higher than something else in, an adaptive capacity. So, yeah, don't try and interpret those numbers across the capacities. In terms of your second, and I think more important question is, can we look at the impact of the individual components, and how are they, well, in the one direction, how do they relate to, improved outcomes and improved recovery, but then also how do they relate to different kinds of program activities? And we do that analysis, and our plan is to do that analysis once we have all of the rounds of this data. It involves, multiple regression analysis where we sort of look at the contribution of each of these components individually in relation to either outcomes or recovery. So your answer to your second question is yes, we can and we plan to do that. These capacity indices we're presenting now, just as we use these as sort of tracking or monitoring indicators that we look at sort of the change of these mix of different capacities that we think are related to different elements of resilience capacity over time. I don't know if that clarifies, but we definitely have, we plan to address your questions about how the program affects these different components, and then in turn how those components affect resilience outcomes. Over.
Thanks, Mark. And it looks like Dan has put in the chat that he'd meant
yeah,
this.
I see.
Oh, okay, you saw that. Okay, great.
I see your comment here, Dan. But yeah. Yes. Again, these scores, you can't really, or you shouldn't compare those scores as sort of, let's say, the quantitative difference in those scores across the different capacities is not, you shouldn't interpret those as being sort of measuring an absolute difference. What we do is that we track each of those capacities separately over time, but the number, like you say, the number 56 versus 33 unabsorptive, that's not a meaningful measure, or a meaningful measure of difference.
Thank you, Mark. Anyone else? And if you don't feel comfortable speaking or your internet connection is shaky, feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat. We will answer those as well. And if there isn't any more for now, we can move on to our closing section. Last call. Anyone have questions?
Karina, perhaps we can very quickly maybe share some implications for RMS inquiry. Of course, we've gathered additional very interesting topics and observations that were raised that we'd like to roll in here, but maybe just to say that we are thinking about how to take these findings and integrate them into the next round in terms of fine-tuning our qualitative and quantitative tools. I think many of the topics that you've raised as well here are very interesting, and there's an opportunity to incorporate them, and we're interested in enhancing our understanding of particularly about, among other things, for example, linkages to credit for input service providers, given that was really a top line finding, trying to better understand supply side constraints, and just also as well, constraints for diversifying into different types of agricultural production and livelihoods, plus all the other topics that came up during this discussion. And one more slide. So we will be updating in terms of next steps. We will be updating the instruments. We plan to conduct the next round in November, December of this year. And we'll be planning for another workshop, as well as for an in-depth inquiry, including a market systems resilience study that's for now slated to take place in May of next year. I think with that, we can wrap up. There are no further questions or comments.
And if you all could take just a minute to fill out our survey about this session, that would really help us for our future events. So thank you very much.
Can I ask a quick question, Gita? So you were saying with those implications that we'll have a chance to kind of take a look at the slides and think again about like what might be most interesting to dig into with these subsequent rounds.
Yes, sure, absolutely. If you have additional thoughts after this presentation and reviewing the slides that you'd like to share with us, we very much welcome them, and we have the opportunity to roll them in.
Okay, excellent.
There's also, there's also a section in the event survey for you to provide any additional thoughts that you have. So you can send it via email or you can send it via the survey. We'll get both.
That's great. I think it will need to like really, there's so much in here, and we could have broken this up into 2 days to go deep into each section. So it'll bear a lot of use looking at each kind of set of findings on its own and really thinking about what that means with this first round, so that the subsequent rounds are a little bit tailored to kind of the questions that are coming up for us now, and we can really use them effectively. But thanks. This was a really, really chock full, interesting, and always exciting to have these moments to stop and take a look at what the analysis is saying.
Thank you so much. And thanks all of you for participating with your insightful questions and comments. It really helps us out. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.